Hi, this is Chris Monk, owner of Highline Guitars, and in this episode of From the Luthier's Workbench, I'm going to be talking about a concept called chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is a term which I'm going to be borrowing from the world of fine art, and what it refers to is the play between light and shadow. And this is a concept which we can use when carving and sanding guitar necks and bodies to help us gauge the quality of the surface that we're forming. You know, wood by its very nature can conceal some of the flaws that are present, which we generated when carving and sanding the surfaces of the neck and the body to get the shapes that we want. And a lot of times we won't see these flaws until we start to apply finish. Then all of a sudden they jump out. And at that point, it's a problem because then you've got to go back and start over sanding to remove those flaws, and that can mess up a finish. So what I try to do before I get to that point is I try to gauge the quality of the surface to see, you know, what the condition of it is. Are there any scratches? Are there flaws? Are there tool marks? That sort of thing. But, you know, because of that wood grain and the color of the wood, and the presence of any figure, all those can combine together to make it very difficult to see those flaws, like I said, until you apply the finish. So what I do is I use a bright shop light that I can hold at a low angle. And this particular light is just one of these cheapo fixtures that I picked up at the local big box hardware store. And I'm using a 60-watt LED bulb. And this is a bright white bulb, and the reason why I like to use LED is because they don't get very hot and they're quite bright. So I just hold it at a very low angle, and as I move the light up and down, the shadow moves across the surface, and that reveals the flaws in the wood. Now, I don't know if you can see this on the video, but there are some fairly serious tool marks here. And there's some tool marks where this volute is. So I'm going to have to grab the sandpaper and work on those areas to get them smooth and to remove them. And another thing that using the light can do is I can check the overall surface quality. And that helps me to decide what grit of sandpaper I'm going to need to start with. Now, by rule of thumb, I always try to start out with the finest grit possible. Ideally, a 150 grit is a great place to start as long as you're able to get away with that. It just means less work. You can go from 150 to 180 to 220, and at that point you're ready to start applying your finish. But like with this neck, I can tell because of the severity of some of these tool marks, I'm gonna have to probably drop down to about an 80 grit, and I'll go 80, 100, 120, 150, 180, and then 220. The 80 grit will be the most involved and will take the most work to get all the tool marks out. But once that's done, each follow-up grit is intended to take out the scratches left from the previous grit. So when I jump from 80 to 100, the 100 is really I'm using that to remove the 80 grit scratches. And then 120 will remove the 100. And then 150 remove the 120, and so on all the way up to 220. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to continue sanding with 80 to remove those scratches. Now, another really good application for the concept of chiaroscuro is that you can use the bright light to gauge the surface quality of the wood as you're moving through the different sanding grits. For example, when you start out at 80 grit or 100 grit, the surface of the wood you're going to notice is going to have some fairly significant sanding scratches left by that grit of sandpaper. And then as you move through each grit, those sanding scratches are going to gradually decrease in intensity. So what you want to do is you want this entire surface of the wood to be covered in the same intensity of scratches. If there are any areas in the wood which appear to be have a stronger intensity, you know you haven't finished in that area yet. So you would continue to sand. So you would start out with your 80 grit, sand the entire surface of the wood down to get the shape and the surface consistent. And then you would use the light over the surface of the wood to kind of show you just how intense those scratches are. And you would want the entire surface to have the same intensity of sanding scratches left by that initial 80 grit sanding. Once you've got it consistent, then you can move on to the next grit. Now, another thing I recommend doing is turning out all the other lights in your shop except for the one source. That will really highlight just how strong those scratches are. And then once you've got the entire surface, like I said, sanded to the same consistent scratches, then you can move on to the next grit, which would be, if you're starting with 100 or with 80 grit, you would then jump to 100, and then from 100 to 120, 120 to 150. Now you'll notice after you make that jump from 80 to 100, those scratches are going to be a little less intense as you sand them, the entire surface of the wood. It does take a little bit of experience. It's not something that's going to be obvious right away, but using light like this will help you to see just how different an 80 grit scratch pattern is to a 100. Now some people will wonder, why can't I jump from 80 grit to say 150? Well, you could, but the problem is 150 grit doesn't do a very good job of removing 80 grit. It will reduce the scratches to some extent, but you're going to find that if you move through the grits from 80 to 100 to 120 to 150 and then 180 and then on, you're going to have a much better surface quality than if you were to take too big of a leap from one grit to the next. So this is just another great application for the concept of chiaroscuro.